Ladies and gentlemen, today is September the 7th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How have you been?
Pretty decent. How about yourself?
Doing all right. Just got some digestive discord going on. That's why I was late.
Oh, that's okay. Did you have any interesting food?
Not really. Just ate some Mexican food yesterday.
Ay, caramba.
Don't normally have problems with it, but for some reason this time there were.
Do you want to know my crazy hack to having mint digestion?
Let me have it.
Apple.
Really?
That's it. Yep, eat one apple. It perfects the whole process. It's crazy. A lot of doctors actually got laid off recently because a few people were posting about apples. They didn't have any work. But apples are really good, especially for offsetting the heavier foods like the meats and the dairy, which I think are more heavy duty for the digestive system. The apple is like the opposite of that. It's water and fiber, which is all the things you need to digest the other stuff.
Huh. I'll have to take that under advisement.
Yep. Doesn't matter what kind. Just pick your favorite. But it's sort of like...
Granny Smith, easy.
Nice. That's a good one. Very tart. There are certain life hacks where there might be a food or a beverage that is kind of heavy on your system, and there's its counterpart that balances you. One of the tricks that someone else told me, I know you don't drink alcohol, but if you're having a lot of alcohol for some reason and you have a Gatorade like kind of interspersed with it, you're a lot likely to be less likely to be super dehydrated. Most of the pain of the hangover and stuff is your body not being hydrated properly. So that's a way to add water and then also add electrolytes, which helps you retain more water.
Interesting.
Yeah. Kind of like the cricket plague that happened in India, and then you like think about what's the counter unit to this. You send planes of ducks at it. It's like, yep, that's gonna work. Just play the counter Pokemon.
There you go.
Yeah, we missed last Sunday because I was at a concert. Went to go see Infected Mushroom in Denver. It was a great show. They played their live band set. Normally they're a duo of two psytrance DJs from Israel, but they also have a live band performance where they have a guitarist and a drummer. And then one of the techno guys, he's playing the keyboard throughout the set and carrying the melody more so than the guitar. And then there's a drummer who's carrying the beat and so on. The guitarist does some solos, but he's more like a rhythm guitar who plays second to the keyboard. And then the other techno guy is the vocalist and the jump up and down person. So, very great energy in their set. I think the older of the two guys is 50 at this point, so they started in the 90s and even played some of their music from their first album, which was in the 90s. It was cool. But great set. Not really any downsides from the show aside from they had no merch table, which seemed like a big miss. And the floor was one of the stickiest that I've ever experienced in my whole life. I was like, how many weeks has it been since we've cleaned this? Like, you can't have possibly spilled this much drink on the floor just tonight, right? There's no way. But it was just very sticky, and then it was about halfway through the set, and then someone walked by me and they were like, excuse me, and then they just poured their beer all over my left arm. And I was like, I didn't say this, but there's a darker version of me that would just like lean into their ear and whisper to them, you're the reason the floor is sticky. Because alcohol metabolizes as sugar, so even though you don't think of it as a sticky beverage like a juice, it ends up turning into something that is sugar, so it ends up making the floor sticky. So, guys, if you're going to get a beverage at the bar, and then you're going to think about going into the fray, like the mosh pit of a hecking concert, drink like half of it before you go in, because you're going to spill it. You're wasting money. You're also making someone else gross and covered in beverage, and then you're making the floor sticky. So there are many reasons to not bring your beverage out into the fray, or at least try to shave off some of the top of it. But it was a great show. We drove there day of and then drove back after the show. So I was DD. That was fun. Got to see the sunrise. Almost hit an owl on the way back, flying in front of the vehicle. That was exciting. Get out of the way, owl! We're going 70 miles an hour. I don't know if you realize that.
It's the kind of problems you have when you live in the Dakotas, huh?
Yep. It's a really beautiful place in the Black Hills out here. A lot of the state is pretty uniform, not quite as aesthetic. But this is the area where a lot of people go for their tourist stuff. You want to see Mount Rushmore, learn about the presidents? You can come up here and do so. They got a lot of presidents. There's a museum that talks about them. The feat of making the monument Mount Rushmore was pretty impressive. Nobody died in making that. Usually when you're on a project of that scale that's on the side of a mountain, you usually have at least a few casualties. Yeah, it was...
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, very well scaled up and then executed architectural feat.
It was started by just one guy, if I recall correctly. Got government support later on. One of those public works project the Roosevelt administration got up to in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
But before that, pretty much just one guy's ambition.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt's definitely someone who's featured a lot up here, because he did a lot for setting aside land for national forest.
Yeah, he was big on conservation.
Are there any downsides of him? Because he seems like a superhero president, based on the ones we've had.
Downsides?
Yeah.
Not any big ones that I'm aware of. I mean, keep in mind, he was selected as vice president. You're aware of like how selection of vice presidents work, right? You kind of pick somebody based off of a group of constituents that you're weak with.
Yeah.
Like if you're weak with the South, you'll pick somebody from the South to be VP, and he'll kind of be your Southern guy to try to win their votes. So, roughly that kind of logic. So at that time, in the late 1800s, early 20th century, there was a prominent progressive movement which was emerging, had been around for a couple decades, which really emphasized anti-corruption, among other things, as well as antitrust, et cetera. So basically a reform movement. And McKinley, who was running for president in whatever it was, 1890 something, he was not really like a reformer. And he wanted one on the ticket in order to try to kind of appease that vote. Maybe not necessarily win all of it, but at least get some of it. And Roosevelt was that guy. And at that time, it was pretty hard for a reformer to become president just because of all the institutional opposition. There were a lot of people that didn't want that in power. But as fate would have it, somebody decided to shoot William McKinley. I think it was an anarchist. And so Theodore Roosevelt kind of became president by accident. So if he seems like an unusually good president, it's because he was a reformer who was chosen not to be the leader, but just to kind of win some reformist votes, who then accidentally became the leader, unintentionally.
I didn't know that. I knew that he filled in as vice president, but not that he was meant to be more so the balancing candidate. Well, every VP is, but I didn't really know what his issues were, so I guess anti-corruption was the main thing.
Yeah, anti-corruption, antitrust. Roosevelt was very much for both.
Huh.
Yeah, and that was a big reason why people liked him so much when he was in office.
Actually caring about an issue, because he was brought in as the symbolic candidate.
Yeah, unfortunately fairly rare. So the stars kind of aligned well for him, if not also the broader public.
There weren't any major wars in that time, right? That was between World War I and World War II?
Yeah, for the United States anyway. I think the only major wars of note in that period were the Spanish-American War, and the subsequent war in the Philippines, in which the United States actually fought like a 10-year war against a Filipino nationalist insurrection. Yeah, not really any big wars, but a number of sort of small bush wars, like little things. In the 1890s, for example, the United States was involved in some shenanigans in the South Pacific, sort of competing with Germany and Britain over control of the Samoan Islands. There was actually a big standoff where all three fleets were in the area, and it was looking like there might actually be war, specifically between the United States and Germany, because of various disputed claims over different Samoan islands. And then a typhoon hit and wrecked everybody's fleets, and so then that cooled everybody off, and nothing happened.
Damn.
There was actually a civil war going on in the Samoan Islands at that time, and different foreign actors were supporting different factions within the conflict as proxies.
It was just two Samoan factions that are fighting?
I think it was three, because I think the Germans had one, the British had one, and the Americans had one.
Damn. I did not know about this. And this was in the 30s?
No, this would have been 1880s or 90s, something in that range.
Huh.
And then the Spanish-American War was 1896, I want to say. And then the Filipino insurrection was roughly 1896 to 1910, something around there.
What was the prevailing Filipino government that wasn't this uprising?
That was the colonial American government that was set up after the Spanish-American War. The Philippines had been a Spanish possession, but the United States extracted it, basically, from the Spanish as a result of the peace treaty that ended the war. Yeah, there was also a bunch of shenanigans in Central America and the Caribbean, because Cuba was a part of the Spanish-American War as well. And there was no conflict fought in Cuba after the war, but there was a lot of tension, because a lot of Cuban nationalists did not like the new government or the new constitution that the United States imposed on them. I believe that was where the famous Platt Amendment came from, which was an amendment written into the new Cuban government's constitution that actually explicitly stated that the United States government had a right to interfere in Cuban affairs. Yeah, you can imagine how nationalists thought about that.
A right to interfere. That's an interesting assertion.
Yeah, pretty controversial. They were pretty sore about it for a very long time. Yeah, I think there was a bunch of civil wars in Central America, too, that ended up drawing the American government in. Mostly just because of Chiquita. Well, Chiquita is what it's called now. Before it was the United Fruit Company.
Dude, fruit companies in Latin America, they're like gangsters. You wouldn't think so. You're like, oh, they sell bananas. It's like, no, they will kill you.
Yeah, they were pretty hardcore back in the day. Yeah, I think Nicaragua was one of the big ones. Big conflict broke out there. Fruit companies successfully lobbied for American intervention. But the U.S. Marine Corps got sent in. I think that was the origin of, what was his name? Smedley Butler, something like that. He was a Marine who got famous for a book he wrote in the 30s in which he argued that the U.S. government and the military were basically a racket that were running interference for large corporations, and that the wars were not in the national interest. They were just bought and paid for by lobbyists. Yeah, people super involved in politics, especially on the political left in the United States, have definitely heard his stuff mentioned before. He gets brought up a lot. Maybe somebody in chat remembers some of the details about his name and whatnot. Haiti also suffered an American intervention in that period that we're talking about, late 19th century, early 20th century. But in their case, it wasn't about bananas. It was just because the government kind of collapsed, as it periodically does. The United States government was somewhat concerned about German influence at that time, Germany was kind of a rising power akin to the United States, and there were concerns about nascent German influence that was rising in the region. European powers, in this period of history anyway, tended to take advantage of things like debt defaults in order to expand their control and influence over developing countries. And Haiti did owe money to the Germans, and so the United States government decided to kind of nip that problem in the bud by staging an intervention and de facto taking control of the country's finances. Yeah, Nicaragua, Haiti, I think were the big ones. But I think there were a couple others as well. I don't remember them as well. Maybe Guatemala as well would have been one. Yeah, the United States was in Nicaragua for a long time. I think that was like a 20-year occupation or something.
Damn.
Lasted into the 1920s.
For the Spanish-American War, what was the catalyst for it starting?
God, what's a good way to put this? I mean, the textbook answer is yellow journalism, but that's such an old term. I feel like a lot of people would not be familiar with it.
I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Think of it as the contemporary equivalent of modern cable television news.
Oh.
Basically just low-quality sensationalist journalism that's designed to get people reading, but that isn't actually concerned about the facts.
Kind of like tabloid
Often.
journalism, almost.
Yeah, tabloid journalism is a good way of putting it. Yeah, there were a number of big newspaper wars at that time. Newspaper wars referring here to competition between newspapers for business. And they tended to be pretty unscrupulous about it. They really just printed anything. The famous Moonbats one always gets me.
Moonbats?
Yeah. One of them ran a front page news story that moonbats had been discovered on the moon. They had pictures and everything, all of it fake, of course.
Wow. Are the moonbats okay now?
I'm sure they're fine. They've got plenty of cheese to eat up there.
That's good.
But yeah, in the case of the Spanish-American War, one of the ways that newspapers started drumming up business was reporting on so-called Spanish atrocities in Cuba, because at that time, Cuban nationalists were fighting with the Spanish colonial government for Cuban independence. And so sympathetic Americans followed the story closely because it was dramatic, and of course newspapers played up the most dramatic elements as best they could in order to ensure good readership. And that kind of led to a whipping up of public sentiment over time, because the atrocities were all kind of exaggerated to the point where the public genuinely believed that the Spanish government there was evil, and that the United States government, as a nominal defender of democratic values, had a responsibility to help a sister republic, to help the Cuban people achieve their independence. So there was some popular support for that, but nobody really wanted to go to war, at least anybody in power. The US government itself was pretty averse to it, didn't really see the benefit. But what happened is that I believe it was a battleship, the SS Maine, was in Havana Harbor and exploded. And newspapers had a field day with that because they said that it was deliberately destroyed by the Spanish in order to send a message to the American people that they were not to be messed with, to deter them from intervening in the conflict. And of course, that whole perspective outraged the public and led to a huge surge in demand for conflict with Spain. Now, of course, more honest journalism would have actually tried to find out what really happened before jumping to conclusions. As it happened, it was an accident on the Maine itself, not any duplicitous efforts by the Spanish government. I think the reporting at the time is that it was a Spanish mine that got them, purposely laid. But in reality, again, just an accident on the ship, resulting in a just deadly explosion that devastated the battleship in question. Regardless, journalists didn't bother looking into any of that. They just said, oh, the Spanish fucked with us. We have to fuck with them back now. And the result is that the US government finally felt compelled under public pressure to actually declare war and intercede into the conflict. Yeah, it very much has shades of sort of 80s, 90s cable television in the United States. Back in the day, sensationalism was very much the driving force. Still is, but now it's gone more in the direction of infotainment. At least back in the 80s and 90s, they actually tried to sensationalize things that were actually happening. Now they don't even have to do that. They can just invent shit out of whole cloth. So newspaper, the media information space in the United States in this time was just as bad, probably worse. Something to keep in mind the next time you hear somebody complaining about the lack of regulations around cable television news. You know, people like to say that the removal of a law back in the 80s that eased regulations on what kind of information and news could be shared on television kind of paved the way for cable television. And my counter argument has always been that the information space in the United States has always been garbage. You know, this is just one example. There are plenty of others. And really, that rule wouldn't have even mattered. You could have kept that in place, and it wouldn't have changed anything, because that rule never applied to cable television news. It only applied to network television. So, you know, whatever your villain of choice as far as cable television news goes, of whatever side of the political spectrum you may be on, that would have still happened. That would have still happened, even if that rule had been kept in place. So yeah, news, be it newspapers, cable television, network TV, magazines, like what have you, there have always been sensationalist, ideologically charged outlets that make their money whipping people up over stupid shit that is very frequently fake. So, that's why the United States fought a war with Spain.
Damn. We got baited into it by fake news. Shit.
Yeah, pretty much. I guess I should also mention Mexico. You were asking about what conflicts were being fought in sort of this period, late 19th century, early 20th century. So Samoa, Central America, Caribbean. Mexico had its revolution, I want to say like 1910. Big civil war, very devastating. And the United States government did intervene in a limited capacity. I think Marines were sent to Veracruz at one point. And I believe the United States government tried to ally with one of the warlords that they saw as more favorable and amenable to American interests, although I don't think he ended up winning. And then, of course, there was General Pershing's famous expedition into northern Mexico, which was launched in retaliation for a cross-border raid by some local warlord in northern Mexico. So a little bit of action there as well.
Damn.
Yeah, but other than that, the United States didn't fight any big wars per se at that time. Relatively quiet. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think there might have been some drama in China as well. We don't really think of China as being like the Wild West per se, but there was definitely a time in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century when it was very, very wild, especially in the warlords period. That kind of started during and after World War I. And so in those times, especially, although a little bit earlier in the period we're talking about, there could be flare-ups of activity. So for example, the Boxer Rebellion, do you remember that?
That sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, they called them Boxers because people in the West at that time didn't really know about, you know, Kung Fu or Chinese fighting. That Chinese martial arts and stuff was still pretty alien. Mm-hmm. So Boxers was the closest approximation they could come. But what happened is that a bunch of martial arts schools, kind of whipped up by nationalism, started targeting Westerners. It was basically a big outbreak of violence and xenophobia. And the Chinese government didn't really mind that. and so didn't really do anything about it.
We don't mind that our citizens are beating up the foreigners.
Yeah, because the Chinese government at that time was getting bullied by Western imperial powers. And so their perception is that anything that inhibits Western influence in China would have been mostly for the good, would have sent a message that they're not welcome and that they should mind their own business. So the Chinese government didn't want to be directly involved, because obviously that would be an act of war, or at least would be perceived as such by Western powers. And so they mostly kind of just distanced themselves from the whole thing. They just said, hey, people are going crazy. You probably shouldn't be here. Well, that didn't work. Western powers were not convinced by that. And when a bunch of nationalists surrounded the basically diplomatic quarters of various that housed Western embassies in Beijing, an expedition was launched in order to rescue them. There's actually a famous movie about, well, I shouldn't say famous. There was a movie made about this called 55 Days in Beijing, about the siege of the diplomatic quarters we're talking about. They actually did survive and were eventually rescued, but it was very, very hairy for a while there. They were isolated in a huge-ass country full of people that absolutely wanted to kill them. So it was not guaranteed that they would make it out. Fun movie. I think you can watch it on YouTube. I don't think anybody cares about the rights anymore. It was made back in the 60s. Definitely recommend that if you're interested in Chinese history. Anyway, the expedition was launched, and it was a multinational effort. It included not just one country, but I think like 12 different ones. Obviously, Britain, France, Germany, the big players. But there were a bunch of bit players as well that kind of threw in some token forces to help out. The United States was among them. So the United States did actually see some combat in China in this period in relation to this particular conflict. I think Japan also sent some forces, Portugal, Spain, Italy as well, although I think those were smaller. Russia definitely participated as well. Very rare pan-European coalition all fighting together. Didn't see that much. In fact, that might have been the only time.
Interesting. I guess it's because they all had some of their people there?
Yeah, exactly. Everybody had delegations there in the diplomatic quarter, and so they were all sort of in common danger.
What was the rescue mission like? Or do they just negotiate them out?
Oh, no, they fought their way to Beijing from the sea.
Oh, damn.
Against both the martial artists and the Chinese army, neither of which were well disposed to be able to defend against an invasion by a modern army at that point. The Chinese had been trying to modernize, but there was so much institutional resistance within China that the effort ended up hobbled, and so they weren't even remotely ready for any kind of large-scale conflict with modern armies. And the martial artists themselves were nomad. They didn't have any modern weaponry. They were largely being motivated by a belief in magic. They thought that if they did little rituals before fighting, then they would be bulletproof. That went about as well as you would expect. Yeah. So they got annihilated, and so the expeditionary force was able, over time, to fight their way from the sea to Beijing, and then they were able to lift the siege of the diplomatic quarter and then extract their personnel. Yeah, quite a bit of retaliatory killing as well was exacted on the local population in Beijing. I think they ended up burning the Summer Palace, which was sort of the summer getaway of the emperor. And I think they also raided the Forbidden Palace and looted it.
Oh. While we're here.
Yeah, exactly. Again, just all retaliatory. I think that was the main action the United States was involved in China at that time. I think there might have been smaller things that kind of propped up, but I think that was the biggest conflict. There was definitely some stuff that happened in the 20s and 30s between US forces and Japanese forces, although those were incidents rather than actual combat. Nothing that involved US forces fighting Chinese forces, though, if I remember correctly. Yeah, the one I'm remembering specifically was in 1935, 6, something around there. There was a American patrol boat that was patrolling the Yangtze River, and it ended up being targeted and destroyed by Japanese aircraft. Must have been like 36 or 37, because that's when the war with China started. So the Japanese aircraft may have mistaken it for a Chinese naval vessel or something. Regardless, it was an accident, and the Japanese government apologized profusely after the fact, because they didn't want to give the US government an excuse to get involved in the war.
I see. Yeah, this is a time period I know very little about. Usually the World Wars get the focus, but there were things going on between.
Oh, you want to talk about the interwar years?
If you want to, yeah. I don't know how this week has been for news, but that sounds cool to me. I don't know shit about this.
Well, let's see. I guess it kind of depends on what part of the interwar years you want to focus on. Because the 1920s were wild in their own right. You know, people tend to focus on the 30s because that was the direct lead up to World War II. Mm-hmm. There was quite a few conflicts in that period that gave people some foreshadowing that something bigger was coming. But the 1920s was actually just as bad, if not worse. People kind of just overlook it because, well, for one, it happened in the wake of World War I, and that was, of course, the big drama that overshadowed quite a bit of the 1920s. In fact, the 1920s was basically just recovery from World War I for most of the world. But here in the United States in particular, we tend to overlook the 1920s because for us, the 20s were great. 1920s for Americans was a boom period. The economy was doing very well. And the United States itself was quite stable, didn't have any big problems for the most part. Largely just kind of forgot about the rest of the world. It spent most of its time coming up with excuses not to deal with things. And I think the United States and Japan were about the only major powerful countries at that time that did really, really well in the 20s. So that tends to skew our perspective. The rest of the world had a really shitty 1920s by comparison. And so they tend to remember it much more negatively than we do. Rightfully so. World War I did not involve a lot of conflict in China or in Russia itself. Western Russia, for the most part, saw most of Russia's combat in World War I. But beyond that, like the rest of Russia wasn't as impacted directly by conflict between the Russian army and the German army. After World War I ended, and actually technically just before it ended, while it was still ongoing, the Russian Civil War broke out. And then it wasn't just Western Russia seeing the conflict, then it was fucking everywhere. Very, very devastating conflict. Millions of people died. I don't know if it was as bad as the Russian experience during World War I, or in World War I, rather. But probably just as bad, at least. And again, that encompassed the entire Russian Empire at that time. Similarly, while China had some combat in World War I, specifically in, I think, the Shandong Peninsula, where the Germans had their little sort of sphere of influence in China. There was some conflict there between mostly the Japanese. The Japanese actually attacked German settlements in Shandong province. But I think the Chinese were nominally involved as well. So that was about the extent of World War I within China's borders. However, during the war, the warlord period started. This is when a bunch of drama involving the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, the subsequent attempt to create a republic, the failure of that attempt, and the subsequent collapse of China into different territories controlled by this, that, or the other warlord. So the warlord period in China was immensely violent. And again, it encompassed, like with Russia, the entire extent of the country's territory. So China went from being largely spared the horrors of World War I to experience its own miniature internal World War I that devastated broad swaths of the country and again killed millions of people. So that kind of extended a little bit into the 30s, but most of it happened over the course of the 1920s and the tail end of the 19-teens. Yeah, there were other parts of the world that had their own issues in the 1920s, but like the big ones were Russia and China, easily. Central Europe and Eastern Europe also very badly impacted. There was the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary, for example, into its constituent parts, and Germany lost a bunch of territory. The collapse of the Russian Empire contributed territory to a bunch of new states. So the creation of all these new entities, all these new countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, resulted in a whole bunch of discord because nobody really knew exactly where the borders of these countries should be. For example, if you have a city that's majority ethnic Polish, but the countryside around that city is majority ethnic, say, Ukrainian, which country should that city belong to? It's kind of a thorny question, right? Obviously, the city itself will want to be a part of Poland, but then the territory around it will want it to be a part of Ukraine. So that's just one example among many in Eastern Europe in this time period that resulted in a lot of ethnic violence. And quite a few wars, actually, generally small in scope, broke out over this in this period. So very, very messy, very chaotic, very ugly period in the 1920s. I'm trying to remember some other places. I think we already talked about American interventions in Central America and whatnot. So Central America, Caribbean also kind of overlaps with the period we're talking about, the 1920s. So that leads into the 1930s, and this is where you start seeing the prelude to World War II kind of emerging. Some people would argue that World War II technically started in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the northeastern part of China. So you can kind of draw a line between that conflict and then the various conflicts that happened subsequently up until the start of World War II and say that constitutes a sort of larger World War II that goes beyond the nominal start date of 1939 that is generally used. So the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese incursion into Shanghai, which I think was about a year later, maybe 2 years after that. Japanese attempts to actually cut up different provinces, to cut off different provinces in northern China from China and make them puppet states. That's even less talked about than Manchuria. I think even a lot of World War II buffs kind of miss out on that one. Those happened in 33, 34 with the two provinces that were impacted respectively. They tried to do it again, but the third effort ended up failing. They kind of hit a wall of resistance. There was a whole kerfuffle in this period between all volunteer armies of Chinese nationalists and proxy forces in northern China being supported by the Japanese government. For the most part, the Japanese proxies got the better of that. But again, the third effort to break off a province in the north failed because the all-volunteer forces were able to beat the Mongolian proxy forces the Japanese were backing. And that kind of brings you up to 35, 36, when the Japanese start gearing up for a conflict with China. 1936 is the other start year of World War II you sometimes hear. 1939 is the main one because that's when Germany invades Poland, but you could say it started with 1936 when Japan invades China, starting the Second Sino-Japanese War, which would, of course, continue through to the end of World War II.
And Japan had a much lower population but way higher tech, which is why they could do that?
Pretty much, yeah. You could say the productivity of the Japanese military was much higher, man for man. So even though the Chinese had way more troops, they could not field, well, they could kind of field a modern army, but they didn't have much besides. They could not field a fully modern military force. Mm-hmm. The Japanese, by contrast, could kind of. I had the kind of, because while Japan's military was much more modern than China's military, it was not actually as modern as equivalent European armies at that time. I've read that Japan's army in the 1930s was roughly equivalent to a European army in World War I. So they were still about 20 years roughly behind Western powers in terms of the quality of their military. Actually, the Japanese Navy was probably a bit more modern. I think it was more equivalent. They had much better training and relatively modern equipment, more so than the Japanese Army, which was more backwards. But they didn't have to be fully modern to wail on China. China was just so far behind them that that wasn't really an issue. The nationalist government had started to modernize their military after the warlord period kind of petered out in the late 20s, early 30s. But that effort was not anywhere near completion by the time the Japanese invaded in 36. Now, fun fact about the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese didn't really want a full-on war with China in 1936. They were actually thinking that it would just be another salami slicing thing, like they've been doing with those provinces I mentioned, that they broke off into puppet governments. They wanted to do that again, basically. They didn't think that it would actually lead to a all-out full-tilt boogie with the Republic of China. The Chinese government, for its part, actually also did not want a full-scale war with Japan at this point. So both parties kind of tripped and fell their way into a larger conflagration. The issue was Chinese nationalists who were screaming for the Chinese government to go to war and fight the Japanese to defend the country. The Chinese government had been resistant to that because they felt very correctly that the Chinese military was not even remotely prepared for a full-on conflict and that they would get their asses handed to them. So they resisted that temptation, that pressure, but in 1936 they didn't feel they could resist it anymore. Public pressure had kind of grown to a fever pitch. A number of nationalist warlords who had kind of nominally been tamed by the Kuomintang, but had not fully been so, were making noise. The communists were making noise about usurping the government. Like, it was a whole thing. And Chiang Kai-shek no longer felt that he could delay it. You know, he kind of felt that he had been pushed into a corner that required him to declare war on Japan. And so the result then is that he attacked the Japanese concession in Shanghai, and that kind of kicked things off for real. If not for that, the Japanese might have actually stopped the invasion and just tried to consolidate around the territory they had taken in the first month or so of the conflict. Yeah, there's a lot of weird shit like that in the Second Sino-Japanese War. The more you learn about it, the more haphazard it seems. It's not really the equivalent of the German invasion of Russia, which is kind of intuitive, right? It's a smaller Axis power invading a larger Allied power. You'd think there would be a lot of parallels, but there's actually not. The German invasion of the Soviet Union was much more well-planned and organized than the Japanese invasion of China. That's a whole conversation unto itself. But the 30s had other stuff going on than just China. The Italians, for example, launched a couple wars. They invaded, for example, Ethiopia in this period. I think that was 35, 36, I don't remember exactly. It was controversial at the time because Ethiopia was a mostly Christian country, and a lot of colonial rationalization centered around Christianizing and modernizing developing countries. An argument that doesn't really hold water when the country in question is already Christian. The Italians, for their part, tried to justify it in terms of slavery, which was technically still legal in Ethiopia at that time. But everybody kind of saw through that. It was very obviously just an excuse to go and conquer another country. Yeah, the response from the British government was kind of mixed. The Italians kind of very much noted that the British did not go to bat for the Ethiopians. And that to them kind of signaled British weakness that contributed to the Italian decision to side more with Germany and eventually join the Axis. I think Churchill was of the mind that the British government should kind of tolerate the invasion and try to kind of make nice with the Italian government in order to ensure they didn't ally with Germany. It was not inevitable that Mussolini would ally with Hitler, even though they were both fascists. There was some Italian discomfort, for example, with German expansion into Austria, which Mussolini kind of hoped would be more in the Italian sphere of influence, as weird as that may sound. And the Italian government actually did complain when the Germans made the move on Austria, the famous Anschluss. But ultimately, the British weren't really willing to do anything about it, and that, in conjunction with, inaction in response to the invasion of Ethiopia, kind of were decisive in ultimately pushing Italy to side with Germany instead of siding with the Western powers. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Spanish Civil War, which was the big one in Europe in the 30s. Are you familiar with this one?
Not very. What were the
Yeah.
factions?
Roughly, it was Republicans versus nationalists. You could kind of break them down into subcategories, but that's pretty much the gist of it. Spain had already been a republic for, what was it, 10, 15 years? Somebody in chat can correct me on that. But the republic, such as it was in the 1930s, was kind of unpopular. There was a lot of partisanship, a lot of old grudges that various factions were trying to settle. It was an angry place, Spain in the 1930s. And some of the really conservative nationalists believed that the republic was destined to fail, and that it was not only that, but that it was also a threat to the country's stability and prosperity. So a nationalist, a general named Franco, organized a coup, which he launched from, I want to say, what was it, Morocco? Or was it that weird little Spanish enclave in northern Africa? I forget which. Morocco was technically part of the French Empire, but it's actually a little more complicated than that. The French and Spanish governments actually had an agreement to govern it jointly. And the French, I think, got the northern 2/3 and the Spanish the bottom third. Some bizarre bullshit like that. Well, regardless, Franco was in charge of some of Spain's African troops, and he flew them back to Spain to start the coup. And that ultimately is what kicked off the Civil War. Now, the Spanish Civil War was notable not just for its brutality and its ideological fervor, but also the fact that it turned into a proxy war relatively quickly. Franco and the nationalists ultimately ended up appealing to Germany and Italy for support, and they ended up getting it. So they got not only weapons, money, but also some small expeditionary units of Germans and Italians. I think the Germans sent some aircraft to fight with the nationalists. The Republicans, for their part, appealed to France and Britain principally for aid in their fight against what they saw as a common enemy, the fascists. But famously and controversially, Britain and France decided not to support them. They didn't want the conflict to escalate and preferred to just stay out of it. Lots of people in both countries were very upset about that. But ultimately, the neutral factions kind of won the argument in both. So the Republicans ended up becoming a proxy of the Soviet Union. The Soviets had no compunction about sending aid to them. They were quite happy to do so. Unfortunately for the Republicans, the Soviets were kind of stupid about it. The Soviets insisted on exacting a relatively high degree of control over the aid that they sent, as well as over certain formations in the field. And so the result then was that secret police sent by the Soviet Union ended up clashing with people and creating unnecessary tension. So while the Republicans did benefit from aid from the Soviet Union, the dissension within their own ranks that was caused by Soviet attempts to police the Republicans ended up severely undermining them. There was actually an all-volunteer force of people from other countries that came to fight in Spain with the Republicans. I think the American contingent was called the Lincoln Brigade. And I think there was a famous American poet that fought with them. I think, was it Emerson? Somebody in chat will have to... Yeah, I want to say it was Emerson, but I would ask for a correction there because I don't really remember exactly. Orson Welles might have been another one. But anyway, the Republicans ended up getting steamrolled eventually. And so Franco was able to seize control of Spain. He did not ally with Hitler or Mussolini, in spite of the fact that he had received significant amounts of material support from them. Spain was not in a good place after the Civil War. It had been pretty devastating. And so the new Spanish government preferred to focus on rebuilding Spain rather than helping out Germany and Italy with this, that, or the other adventure that they were indulging in over the course of the 30s.
Excuse me.
So the Spanish Civil War, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Japanese shenanigans in China, These are some of the big defining conflicts of the 30s. There's a bunch of smaller ones in Latin America, generally involving nationalist governments fighting over disputed border territory. I think Ecuador fought a small one with Colombia in this time. And I think Bolivia also fought one with Paraguay over the Gran Chaco region. I believe Paraguay actually ended up winning that.
The author / writer, I think, was Hemingway.
Hemingway, okay.
Ernest Hemingway. Also in the E section, but first name, not last name.
There you go. Yeah, I'll take that as a cue for the usual disclaimer. I am not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while I do this, but I do read it after, and we do enjoy the feedback, so participation by chat is encouraged.
You're saying you're not an expert in American literature?
I am not. Okay. Very much not. Especially poetry. Never been a big poet guy.
Yeah, Hemingway's writing style is very dry and direct compared to a lot of others that are more flowery and verbose. I think it kind of fits the military background. You state the information pertinent to the situation and nothing further.
I think that's a pretty decent overview of the interwar years, or at least conflicts in the interwar years.
Awesome.
That doesn't really include examples of large-scale political instability. I think Argentina in this period had a lot of problems. I think there was a period called the infamous years, something like that, that started in the 30s, continued into the 40s. It's a period of significant instability in politics that saw coup attempts, whatnot, and eventually the military just outright seizing control. And then I think Brazil had a few issues as well. I think there was an outright communist uprising in 1935 in Sao Paulo, I think it was. Made the government very paranoid about communists, suffice to say. And I think there was, I think this is when the Novo Estado got started. Or is Novo Estado Portugal? I forget. Maybe I'm mixing up my despotisms. Yeah, Vargas was the dictator who seized control of Brazil in the 30s. But I don't remember what he called his government, because there was another dictator in Portugal at the time who kind of ran a nationalist authoritarian government along similar lines to Vargas. That was Salazar, if I remember correctly. And I think maybe it was him who called his new government the Novo Estado, the new state. Yeah, Salazar was interesting because he was, if not fascist, then sort of fascist adjacent in terms of ideology. But he never allied with the Axis, and I don't think he had any particular desire to. You know, he didn't receive help from them like Franco did. And also, Portugal had always had pretty good relations with the British. I don't know how well known this is, but Portugal actually has the oldest longing-standing alliance in existence right now. It's an alliance with the British that goes back to 1300 or something ridiculous like that. It's like an old medieval alliance.
Damn.
That has been in more or less continuous effect since then. So Portugal didn't really have any particular desire to fuck with the British, and so that kind of pacified them in a sense, as far as any temptation there might have been to ally with more like-minded governments in this period. Kind of made it awkward later when the United States wanted to involve them in NATO after World War II. It's not really an interwars year thing, but yeah, after World War II, the United States wanted access to islands in the Atlantic that it could use as air bases to refuel American bombers crossing the Atlantic. as well as anti-submarine warfare bases, naval bases, that kind of thing. The American thinking is that those bases would be critical to maintain security in the Atlantic in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. So there's a big push by Washington to get Portugal into NATO as it was being formed in the late 1940s. And there was some British reluctance about that, not least because Portugal was an authoritarian government very similar to the governments that they had just finished fighting in World War II. So there was an immense amount of skepticism stemming from that. But ultimately, the United States got its way, as you might expect. And Portugal was somewhat awkwardly shoehorned into the NATO alliance.
Yeah, Portugal had a lot of map presence, you could say, in the world for a pretty long period of time. Seems like it was fairly significant given their population size and landmass. It doesn't seem like a huge place.
Yes and no. If you look at a map of the Portuguese Empire at its height, it looks very large. In that sense, you're correct. But no, in the sense that those maps are very misleading. Portugal didn't really actually control all of that territory. The Portuguese Empire's presence in the territories it claimed was always pretty meager. Even in the case of Brazil, if you look at a map, it looks like they just kind of conquered and subjugated the coast of Brazil. But that wasn't really the case. They claimed the land. There wasn't really a strong enough native presence to really deny them control over the territory along the coast. But the coast wasn't really worth very much, and so there was very little colonial activity in Brazil through the 1500s and into the 1600s. It wasn't really until the later 1600s and 1700s, I think, that the Portuguese presence in coastal Brazil really got to be anything resembling significant. And the Portuguese presence in colonial holdings in places like India and the Far East, those were more substantive, but still not that substantive. A lot of that was actually factories, which I think we've talked about before. Factories in the early modern period of history.
Yeah, I remember that.
This is like 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Factories at that time did not refer to places of manufacturing. Rather, factories referred at that time to trading outposts. So these were basically glorified warehouses where merchants could store their stuff, maybe have disputes settled by the local head of the factory, who was generally from the same country. Sometimes they were fortified. That was also pretty common, but that was mostly to defend them against rival merchants from other rival European countries, not so much against the locals. And generally, the factories were actually not controlled by the country the merchants were from. They technically were under the jurisdiction of whatever native ruler owned the territory they were on. In that sense, they were basically, again, just like warehouses. The European merchant in question would go in, buy the rights from a local ruler to set up a factory, and then would do so. So Portuguese control over those factories was actually not sovereign, in the sense that the territory the factories were on were not the sovereign territory of the European country, of the merchant who bought them and founded them. Rather, they were just controlled by the merchants themselves. Now, it gets a little blurry when you consider that governments in Europe at this time, and certainly the elites that kind of manned those governments, very frequently owned shares in these companies that were trading in the Far East. So while the governments themselves did not directly control them, you could argue they kind of indirectly controlled them by dint of their ownership, partial ownership of the merchant companies in question. But that kind of gets into the weeds a little bit. Regardless, it's very misleading to show a map of, say, Portugal controlling the Spice Islands, for example, or Malacca, or, say, Macau, to a lesser degree, because often control was more indirect than that. Now, there were some exceptions, Macau, for example, and Bombay, as well as smaller territories that probably people haven't heard of before, Du, for example, or Gao. Two small Portuguese enclaves in Western India. These were all territories that the Portuguese crown actually were able to force, or at least negotiate for local kingdoms to actually concede to them. So in these cases, these are actually territories controlled by the Portuguese government. That kind of stemmed from very early Portuguese expeditions that engaged in a significant amount of piracy, generally in the Indian Ocean. And as a result, were able to get this, that, or the other kingdom to concede territory to them as a quid pro quo in exchange for the Portuguese easing up on the piracy. But those territories that they directly controlled were much, much smaller in scope than you would suspect looking at a map of the Portuguese Empire at its height on Wikipedia. Much more modest in that sense.
Now, chat's saying that Portugal is more of a trading empire than a colonial one.
Again, kind of, sort of, Portugal is kind of a special case, because when we think of merchant empires in the 1600s, for example, you think of the Dutch, the English, etc., and they really did have like more mercantile empires, trading empires where they were principally just exerting influence through factories and whatnot, and kind of had limited political influence until maybe the late 1700s, certainly in the 1800s. Portugal, by contrast, actually started out less mercantile and more violent. Because remember, they actually started exploring like 100 years before everybody else. They were not an empire of the 1600s. Theirs was an empire of the 1500s. So at the same time that the Spanish conquistadors were sailing out and subjugating the Americas, the Portuguese equivalent of conquistadors were actually expanding out and engaging in similar activity in the Indian Ocean. The problem the Portuguese had is that they were much, much weaker than a lot of the major native kingdoms they were encountering. So, for example, when they first reached India, the Mughal Empire was still at its height. Actually, technically, it was sort of just starting. Yeah, some weird overlap there. We think of like European empires encountering powerful Indian empires in the early part of the Age of Discovery. That's actually not entirely true. When the Portuguese first reached India in, I think, the early 1500s, the Mughal Empire was still only a couple decades old and was still in the process of expanding to its height. But over the course of Portuguese exploration, over the course of the 1500s, by the end of that period of the 1500s, the Mughals had reached the height of their power. So some interesting timing there, that they were able to kind of get there just at the right time. But the Portuguese engaged in relatively limited trading in this period, because again, the logistics were just awful, right? They didn't have the same access to faster ships like some of the later Europeans that started trading in the 1600s would have. And also their impetus was more colonial. They were more interested in fucking up trading networks, proselytizing people, confronting Muslims. That was another thing that they did disproportionately. Again, they were really more like barbarian pirates than they were like the merchants of the Dutch and the English that would come later. So you're correct Chad is correct that they engaged in mercantile activity. That was definitely part of the impetus for why they were there, and it did color their early interactions with natives. But at the same time, the Portuguese early colonial efforts in the 1500s was much more colored by violence than mercantile activity. They were much more interested in that than some of the later iterations of European empires that would emerge later. To give you an example, when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope and started expanding, discovering, I should say, exploring the southeastern coast of Africa, they encountered some small trading states that had been set up there that were part of the broader Indian Ocean Arab trading merchant network. And one of the first things they did when they realized that these city-states, specifically one particular city-state at the mouth of the Zambezi River, when they realized they were relatively weak, they actually conquered it. They actually unloaded their troops from their ships and just conquered the city and occupied it for a while. I think they eventually ended up getting kicked out, or maybe the city kind of collapsed naturally. From what I remember, it was already in decline by the time the Portuguese reached it. But you could say the Portuguese invasion was sort of the coup de grace, at least. And from there, they moved up further north and encountered a bunch of city-states in places like Zanzibar, the Somali coast. They also ended up engaging in, invading, let's put it like it is. They ended up invading a number of those states as well. They had more mixed success there because those city-states were relatively strong compared to the Zambezi River state that I mentioned earlier. But I think they did occupy a couple of them. So again, that's a marked contrast to, say, English and Dutch merchants, which were focused almost exclusively on trade in the early decades. They didn't go out and try to conquer anybody and everybody. Portuguese, by contrast, were definitely picking fights in the early going.
Yeah, the image of a pirate is more, I guess, anarchist in nature, but a lot of effective piracy was like privateering, where you're basically a commissioned ship of a country that is saying, okay, go ahead and salvage what you can from this area, beat people up, take their stuff, if not trade, and come back. It's basically the same kind of Viking approach, where you bring well-equipped, well-armed people who have valuable stuff, and you decide, okay, we're going to go to this area, and if it's good to fight, then we'll do so. If it's not, then we'll trade or leave. And that's the flexibility of an aquatic expedition, is you're a lot harder to pursue back. You have an easy retreat method. They can't send an army at you. They have to send boats at you.
Yeah, you're exactly correct. And keep in mind that Portugal was still, well, Europe in general in this time was still relatively undeveloped relative to the large Asian empires like the Qing dynasty or the Mughal Empire. So they were perceived broadly, especially in the Muslim world, as being relatively backwards. And so having all of these European ships pop out of nowhere and just start fighting with everybody definitely seemed like barbarian behavior to them.
Yeah.
Kind of like the Crusades from the Muslim perspective were just European barbarians invading the Holy Land. Similar dynamic. Yeah, the advantage the Portuguese had is that their ships were just technologically a generation or two ahead of the locals. Mm-hmm. So even though they were on the other end of a very, very long supply chain, they were still able to win naval battles against both the Ottoman Navy and the Mughal Navy because they were just so much further ahead. Mm. Yeah, regional naval vessels tended to be more short range. They tend to be smaller, and they tended to be relatively lightly armed. They were kind of designed more to be, well, I should say they were economized for local conditions, let's say. They weren't designed to be big ships that could go on really long expeditions and carry a whole shit ton of cannons, like the Portuguese vessels were. Mm-hmm. What was that? I think I had some other trivia about Portugal. Oh, right. So when the Portuguese first started exploring, they actually started with the west coast of Africa, because Europeans hadn't really explored that very much. And so that was an early focus. So you might think that they were able to kind of map that out and explore it relatively quickly before finding the Cape of Good Hope and finally making it into the Indian Ocean. That's actually not true. I think it took them something like 50 years to finally round the Cape of Good Hope. Because they actually started exploring in the mid-1400s. And they didn't round the Cape of Good Hope until the early 1500s. So it took them that long to finally get all the way down to southern Africa. It was a very, very long period of time. Okay. And it took them another couple decades after they kind of rounded the Cape of Good Hope to kind of really explore the Indian Ocean and penetrate further east into the Spice Islands and the East Indies. So the age of exploration happened very incrementally. It didn't happen all at once. In fact, it took so long that what would happen is that the Portuguese would sail out, explore some new territory on the west coast of Africa, and generally set up an outpost or a factory. And what would happen is that the sailors manning that base would intermingle with the locals because they didn't have the same hang-ups that, Anglos and Northern Europeans had about intermixing. So the Portuguese sailors, they would raise families with local wives, and they would produce mixed-race offspring. And they, in turn, would raise that offspring, and that offspring very frequently would actually become the sailors that would man the ships that would explore further. Yeah, so they started out West Africa, and then they would raise a generation, and then that generation would man the ships that would go further south, and then onward. And so the result is that all along the path that the Portuguese explored, trying to push into the Indian Ocean, they left a whole bunch of settlements of mixed-race children and mixed-race populations. I think when they actually got to South Africa, they set up one of the first, I think the first European colony in the Cape territory, in what is now southwestern South Africa. And the Portuguese there intermingled with a local indigenous group that was called the Khoisan, I want to say, something like that. That was an indigenous group that was very small and had not really been as influenced by the Bantu-speaking populations further north. And they actually were so isolated that they ended up getting ravaged by disease, which you wouldn't really think an African population would be subject to, but again, this was a relatively isolated tribal group. And the result is that the Khoisan became genetically intermingled with the Portuguese to the point where they were basically indistinguishable. Not entirely indistinguishable, but ethnically speaking, genetically speaking, I don't think there's any pure-blood Khoisan left in South Africa. I think almost all of them are related, at least to some degree, to Portuguese sailors from the 1500s. And again, the subsequent offspring from that would man the Portuguese ships that pushed into the Indian Ocean. Yeah, the Portuguese were all about intermingling and proselytizing. Very big on Catholicism. I think we've talked before about Goa, right?
Yeah, Goa, India.
Yeah, so Goa today is one of the few Christian provinces of India, and that's specifically because it was one of the territories that was explicitly given to them in the 1500s. And they proselytized very, very hard. In fact, they actually had more than a few inquisitions in Goa, as a result of which there was a significant conversion of the local population. Yeah, the Portuguese ended up losing most of their empire over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, stemming from conflicts with the Dutch and the English. More so the Dutch, I think. But eventually things settled down and they were able to keep what was left of their empire because of English protection. Like I mentioned before, they'd always had good relations with the English, so the British didn't really want to take their empire from them violently. They weren't really especially threatened by it in any case. They had far better territories by the time the British Empire got to be a thing. Yeah, I think the last major overseas Portuguese territory was Macau, I think, which was not handed back to the Chinese until 1999, if memory serves.
That's very recent.
Yeah, relatively. Not much left of them now. Big influx of Chinese from other parts of China into Macau, so the small native population of mixed Chinese Portuguese people has kind of been swamped. I don't know if they're going to be around much longer. Have you ever heard of Socotra?
Sounds familiar, but I can't say what it is.
It's an island off the coast of Yemen, and it ended up becoming part of the Portuguese Empire as a major outpost in, well, just outside of the Red Sea anyway. It sat astride major trading networks connecting Europe with the Middle East and the Indian Ocean trading networks. So the Portuguese were quite attracted to it. I think it ended up in the hands of the British later. You've probably seen pictures of it, because there's a bunch of trees on Socotra that are ancient. Like trees on Earth kind of looked very different millions of years ago. And they evolved into their present form over that time period. But there's a couple places on Earth where they were not as affected by that evolutionary change, and the trees still look like they did way back when. And Socotra is one of them. So the funky-looking trees on Socotra are definitely one of the things it's known for. Anyway, I just bring it up because that was part of the Portuguese Empire as well, back when it was at its height.
Did not know that. Cool.
Must have been pretty bizarre to be the first Portuguese to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no equivalent to the trees there in Europe. Was there anything else you wanted to know about the interwar years?
Socotra, you said it's called?
Yeah, Socotra.
Yeah.
TRA?
Oh, yeah, that kind of tree. Yeah, I think I've seen pictures of these.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Looks like a very aesthetic place. Nice.
Yeah, hasn't really been impacted by the civil war in Yemen. Everybody just there is pretty chill and just kind of minds their own business. It's part of Yemen now, which is why I mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
Legally handed over by the British back in the 60s or something.
Socotra is its own language.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Most people there speak Arabic and Socotra.
I thought it was just Arabic. I had no idea they had their own native language. Huh.
Seems like it'd be a really cool vacation destination, but it's kind of far.
Yeah, pretty distant.
Interwar period. Did Australia do anything during this time?
I think it became a dominion? Or was that earlier? Actually, I think that was probably earlier. That was probably like 1910 or something. Yeah, a lot of the Anglo-Saxon overseas colonies of the British Empire were given autonomy in the early 20th century in the form of what was called dominions. 1901, there it is. Okay, so much earlier than the interwar period. No, I don't think Australia really did too much in the interwar period, at least nothing that I know about, which isn't necessarily saying much. Australia is one of those countries that tends to fly under my radar.
It seems like if they just got their autonomy, then they probably would be still establishing themselves during that time rather than engaging in adventurism.
20, 30 years. They probably more or less kind of had things set up by then. And they'd already had their own government. It was just colonial in nature, not fully self-sufficient. Yeah, Australia got a dominion, New Zealand, and I think Canada as well. I think Canada's is older, though. 1860-something, 1867. They were a little worried about the Americans after the Civil War.
I can understand why.
Yeah, we had a pretty big army by the end of the war. Canadians not entirely sure how we would be using that after the conflict ended.
Did we really, though? What happened to the Civil War army after? People just get to break for a little bit?
Occupation of the South was one of the big things. But there definitely was demobilization. It wasn't as big in the years after the war as it was during the height of the war. Not full demobilization, though. Yeah, still big enough to be of concern if you're a neighboring state.
Chat's asking, when did Canada burn down the capital?
Do what?
When did Canada burn down whose capital?
Oh, Washington, D.C.?
Did they?
No, the British did during the War of 1812, which involved Canada. But I don't believe it was Canadian troops. It was British Marines unloading in Maryland, marching on D.C. and then burning it.
Huh.
I think the United States, well, American forces during the War of 1812 did burn Toronto. I think it was called Toro at that time. And it wasn't even really a city. I think it was just like a town at that time. Maybe not even that, maybe just an outpost. But technically, we have burned Toronto before. But that would not have been the capital of Canada. I think the capital was Montreal at that time. Or maybe Quebec. I don't think there was really any big English settlements in Canada at that time. Actually, technically, Canada would not have existed. Canada, as we know it now, is basically just the Dominion of Canada, which was an agglomeration of all the different British territories in what is now Canada. So Quebec, the Maritime Territories, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, etc., and then British Columbia were basically all different colonies. And the British just kind of lumped them all together into one country when they formed the Dominion of Canada. Did you know that Newfoundland wasn't part of Canada until 1949?
No, that's really late. Was it French?
Yeah. No, it was a British colony. It was actually a British crown colony, directly governed by the British government.
Did not know that.
Yeah, it was not made a part of the Dominion of Canada in the 1860s. So it just stayed its own, well, it stayed a quote-unquote independent British colony, not part of Canada. I think they did move it towards independence in the early 20th century, but they had a bunch of debt problems, and so they ended up making it a colony again. Didn't work out too well. So after World War II, they had a referendum in which the people of Newfoundland were going to decide whether they wanted to be a part of the US, a part of Canada, or independent. And I remember there was actually considerable lobbying on the part of the Canadian government to ensure that they voted for Canada, because apparently there was some concern they might actually join the United States. But as was, they ended up voting to join Canada, and so it came to pass.
Huh. Today I learned. I don't know what else in the interwar I'd want to ask about. I don't know if we had questions this evening, but I didn't really notice anything big this past couple weeks for news aside from like rumors that Trump died, but then he didn't. That was about the dankest stuff we could drum up.
Yeah, some collective wishful thinking on the part of Reddit there, I suspect.
Where is he? We haven't seen him tweet in 4 seconds. Well, maybe he's no longer with us.
Yeah, I do have new stuff. It's kind of accumulated over time. So there's stuff to talk about when we're ready.
Cool.
But I do enjoy talking history, so if you want to do that,
So
I'm not opposed.
you were saying the Mughal Empire was kind of on its rise during that period?
Yeah, 1500s, when the Portuguese were finally penetrating the Indian Ocean and exploring it, roughly correlated with the rise of the Mughal Empire. Because I don't think that the people, this is like the Central Asian Turkish Muslims who founded the Mughal Empire, they didn't actually start invading India and creating the empire until like 1501, something like that, very, very early 1500s. So I think by the time that the Portuguese actually first made contact with India and the Mughal Empire, I think the Mughal Empire was actually still just a northern Indian entity. They had not yet expanded into eastern or southern India yet. Yeah, there was actually a period in the mid-1500s when the Mughal Empire collapsed. They were actually pushed out by a rival, basically Muslim nobleman. And I think they were, that is to say, the Mughal ruling family was kind of exiled from India for like 10 years before rallying an army and invading and reconquering their territory from this usurper. After that, they were able to continue their rise to power, their rise to the most powerful empire in the history of South Asia.
What made them so powerful?
Well, I mean, basically, they just controlled the single wealthiest empire in the history of humanity up until that point. India was immensely wealthy, like it was the center of global civilization. Debatably, China also equally, if not more, wealthy, but pretty close regardless. Like an immensely huge state, immensely wealthy territories. So that made the Mughal Empire inherently powerful.
And is that the sort of lineage of the current administration? Because I think Britain had control over India for a while.
No. No, the Mughal Empire was well into its decline by the time the British Empire really got its hooks into India. So the Mughal imperial state continued to grow probably up until the early 1700s. And after that, it started to decline. And a major part of that was the rise of the Maratha Empire, which was a Hindu empire that emerged in Western Mughal territory in the mid-late 1600s. It was actually a confederation of local Hindu nobility from Western India in what is now Maharashtra, ethnically Maratha in ethnicity, that revolted against the Mughal Empire and successfully won their independence and chipped away at the Mughal Empire over the course of the next 100-some years until they themselves became a large empire. Yeah, after that, the Mughals lost pretty much all of their southern territory, not just to the Marathas, but also to local noblemen who revolted against their rule and set up their own states. I think by the time you get to the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was restricted to the western Gangetic Plain. Well, that's not really... They pretty much controlled the entire Gangetic Plain. So pretty much all of the most settled parts of northern India were still part of the Mughal Empire by 1750, roughly speaking. But the problem they had is that their state was so weak that the feudal territories that their empire was subdivided into were run by very powerful nobility that could effectively ignore the Mughal emperor. You know, the Mughal emperor wasn't really strong enough to completely corral them, so they had an immense degree of autonomy to the point where they were de facto independent. Yeah, one of the most powerful of those was the Nawab of Bengal. Bengal was one of the most wealthy parts of South Asia, actually the world, really, at that time. Bengal and the lower Yangtze were probably the main economic centers of the world at that time. So the Nawab of Bengal, in turn, was an immensely wealthy man. Nawab is like the name of the guy who technically governed the territory. That made it relatively easy for the British to kind of worm their way in. And, because the Nawab of Bengal derived his wealth from trade, European traders, being the most powerful in the territory, had an immense amount of influence. An uncomfortable amount of influence, to the Mughal emperor and the Nawab. And they actually, part of the reason they went to war with the British in the 1750s was specifically to curb British merchant influence in Bengal. And that failed pretty catastrophically. The result of the first war was that the British ended up with the right to collect taxes in Bengal. I believe that's what it was. Technically, the territory was still governed by the Nawab, so the British were not in full control of Bengal. But they did control the purse strings to the administration, and of course that de facto means that they were indirectly in control. Now, there was another war not too long after that in which the British just straight up had control of the territory. It was still not full control. It was technically control of the province on behalf of the Mughal emperor. So the Nawab technically was still there, but the administration the British set up was actually in control. And of course, they were still collecting taxes as well. So it was at that point that the British really got their first major territorial concession in South Asia. They already had a few here and there, but Bengal and the control of the province as a whole, as a result of these conflicts in the mid-1700s, that was the first big territorial gain they got on South Asia. And from there, they expanded outward until they eventually conquered all of India. But by the point all this was happening, the Mughal Empire was, more or less a zombie empire. Like, the emperor couldn't even control his most influential, wealthy provinces. He stayed around, though, even as the British Empire chipped away at his territory and eventually gained control of the Gangetic Plain. There was still a Mughal rump state that continued to exist into the 1800s. And it would continue until the Sepoy Revolt in the 1850s. That was the first big revolt against British rule in India. And by this point, the British had control over the entirety of South Asia. But this revolt came very close to ending that. The British were able to kind of rally in time and crush the rebellion, but it was large enough in scope to have potentially ejected them. And the Mughal emperor was actually a major proponent of the revolution, and certainly a major participant. So after the revolution had been crushed, the British moved in and pretty quickly clipped his wings. They made it very clear that while they would not kill him, they were going to ensure that he would be the last emperor, and after that they were going to divide up his territory and formally end the Mughal Empire. Yeah. So when you ask me if the Mughal Empire and their state was inherited by the British and became the British Empire, definitely not. It was mostly gone by the time of the British Empire. And after the Sepoy Revolt, the vestigial Mughal state was completely destroyed.
Technical question: what is a rump state? Is that like Djibouti?
No. No, a rump state is just sort of a generic term that refers to a state that is carved out of the territory of a larger empire. So if you go to war with an empire, or maybe just a large country, and you conquer all of it, but then leave some territory to the state that you defeated, the residual state is a rump state. It's basically the rump of something that had been larger.
I see.
The Germans, the Nazis, I should say, in World War II were actually planning, after they conquered the Soviet Union, to leave a Russian rump state to their east. In other words, they didn't plan on actually conquering and occupying all of Russia. The plan was to conquer all of Russia up to the Ural Mountains. And the rest of Russia east of the Ural Mountains would be a Russian rump state that would continue to be nominally independent. How are we doing on time?
I'm going for an hour and a half.
Gotcha. Well, I've got some updates if you're interested.
Sure.
Well, the Prime Minister of Japan has finally resigned. He was already on borrowed time, but now it's official. He's gone. And so now the LDP is scrambling a bit to find a replacement. Not really helping their popularity. Kind of feels like the LDP is on the way out, but there's not really any clear-cut replacements, so they may kind of continue on anyway.
Why
We
did you
shall
resign?
see. He's already unpopular. You know, he hasn't really been able to fix anything. The LDP itself is very unpopular, owing to a whole litany of corruption scandals that have occurred over the past couple of years. So I don't think there's any one specific thing. I'm probably forgetting, but I don't think there's any one specific thing that led to his resignation. Yeah, I think he has somewhat failed to implement his reform program, too. That might also be part of it. I'm kind of blanking out on this one. I'm sure somebody in chat will probably have something more specific that could comprise the impetus here. But my understanding is that he's been on borrowed time for a while, and that the resignation is just the culmination of that.
I see.
I was reading today that he might be replaced with a woman. She's one of the leading contenders to become the new prime minister. And that would be really interesting, because I believe that would be the first time Japan has had a female prime minister. Something to keep your eye on. I don't think there's broader implications, though. Yeah, Ashiba was kind of known for being more about constraining government spending. He wanted to try to kind of pull back from Shinzo Abe's fiscal expansionism in order to kind of address Japan's outstanding debt issue, which is indeed pretty outstanding. But now that he's gone, markets are a little concerned, because they think the incoming prime minister, whoever it might be, may be more interested in fiscal expansion, despite the fact that they don't really have fiscal room to do that. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think one of the things that it sank Kashiba is that he was opposed to fiscal expansion. There's some demand in Japanese politics for more government spending and less austerity, unsurprisingly. And Ashiba was definitely the austerity guy.
Mm. So I know the yen is pretty low right now. Does that hurt them in any way? Or is that good in certain ways?
Japan is an export-dependent economy, and having a relatively less valuable currency helps them with that, because it makes their exports cheaper to foreign consumers.
Oh.
So that is technically beneficial. It does hurt a little bit in terms of inflation, though, because when your currency is less valuable, that makes imports of foreign stuff more expensive. And because Japan is not self-sufficient in natural resources, all of the natural resources like oil, metals, whatnot that they have to import are relatively more expensive, and that drives up the cost of production, which can eat into the profits of companies and also makes consumer items more expensive. Let's see, that's Japan. I actually did have some Australia stuff for once.
Nice.
Let's see, there were protests all over Australia, I think a week or two ago. And they were actually right-wing protests regarding immigration, which is of interest to me because when I was growing up, mass protests were almost always left-wing in orientation. Relatively rare for them to be right-wing. But I've seen that more over the past 5 years. Kind of a weird evolution. I don't think they were huge protests. I don't think anti-immigration protests necessarily have the backing of the bulk of the population, but there are enough people that there were protests almost all over. A whole multitude of cities had them. And then I was reading today about a sunscreen scandal.
Mm-hmm.
So as you might guess, people in Australia use a lot of sunscreen. In fact, there's apparently a whole bunch of public information campaigns about that, among other things. And the scandal that's been breaking out has to do with a finding that a whole bunch of different sunscreen brands apparently are just utterly ineffective, or at least are not nearly as effective as advertised. And so that has people very upset because the Australian government has very strict laws about sunscreen. Apparently the industry is very regulated, and there are high standards about approving sunscreens in Australia. Despite this fact, a whole bunch of bogus sunscreens have managed to get into the market. So apparently a bunch of people are very upset about that. Consumers especially, as you might imagine.
How much money are you saving by making a fake sunscreen? It's a really weird demographic to try to scam.
Well, you know, being a major consumer makes them an attractive target. If you can get some really cheap, low-quality sunscreen into the market, you could potentially make a bunch of money before people found you out.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Thailand had an update about them. Been some goings on there. I think we've been talking over the past month or two about the shenanigans involving the government, the border war with Cambodia, the removal of the prime minister for supposed ethics violations, one kind or another.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of came to a head in the past couple weeks. The prime minister was actually formally removed. She had been temporarily removed pending a judgment by Thailand's Supreme Court up till now. But now she has been ruled to be formally removed, and so she's gone. So there's been a bunch of jockeying between this, that, and the other coalition partner within the ruling coalition about who the new prime minister should be. And they actually have decided on this guy, what's his name? Anutin Charnvirakul. I cannot pronounce Thai names for shit. Charnvirakul, let's go with that. Actually, that's his first name. His family name would be Anutin. So Prime Minister Anutin is going to be the leader of Thailand going forward. He's the leader of the Bum Jai Thai party. Don't ask me what that means. I don't know. But he's the Bum Jai Thai party, from what I read, is a fairly conservative party. It had been in the coalition between conservative parties and the Pheu Thai party, which was Thaksin's party. This guy, Anutin, and his party were, I believe, the party that defected from the coalition outright after the recording of the Pheu Thai prime minister conversation with the leader of Cambodia came out, was leaked. And they jumped at that as an opportunity to try to get Pheu Thai out and maybe get their guy in. And their effort has apparently succeeded. They did negotiate their leader into the prime minister's office. Now, I would point out here that the only reason they're going to be able to do this is because they actually got the support of the Reform Party. This is the People Party, as it's now called. It's had different names over the past 10 years. They keep getting sued and having to disband in the party and reform it under a new name. So the Reform Party is opposed to the Conservatives, wants to remove lèse-majesté laws and implement a whole bunch of reformist shit, which, of course, the Pheu Thai party and the Conservative parties absolutely hate and don't want to do. However, the People Party, rather, controls about 1/3 of the seats in the legislature, which makes them a kingmaker. And so in order to get their guy into office, the Bum Jai Thai party made a deal. And the terms of the deal are basically twofold, at least two major elements that I have in my notes. One, they agreed to hold an election in 4 months, which means you could see yet more churn in Thai politics pretty soon. And the other condition was that the new government would start the process of amending the military constitution under which the Thai government is governed. Thai military is going to be very sensitive to that, so I'm dubious about the prospects for actually changing it. But it does open the door to some potential actual reform that could mitigate the Thai military's political power, which, if you're a reformist, is definitely one of the top things you want. I would point out, for those of you who maybe don't remember the Thai constitution that was implemented not too long ago, it hasn't even really been around that long. It was imposed by the Thai military, and it reserves a significant amount of seats in the Thai legislature for military appointees. So basically, the Thai military has a de facto veto over much of what the legislature in Thailand can do. So, of course, if you're a reformist who is opposed naturally to the Thai military, that's a problem. And changing that is a major priority. And Bumjatai has not promised to do that, but has promised to start the process. So hypothetically, it could be done in the future. Also, in other Thai news, Thaksin himself was actually acquitted in a lèse majesty case and has now fled the country. So it really feels like Pheu Thai is kind of on the outs here. You know, their leader, who had been allowed back into the country as part of the coalition deal that the Conservatives formed with Pheu Thai after the last election, now he's gone. And also his party's prime minister, who had been heading the coalition, also now gone. So it's not really clear what's going to happen with Pheu Thai here. Maybe they make an alliance with the People Party, but I don't know if they want to do that. I don't know if the People Party even trusts them enough to do that, given that they already stabbed them in the back once. The Conservatives obviously fucking hate them. If there's one through line in Thai politics over the past couple decades, it's that the Conservatives in Thailand just absolutely fucking loathe Thaksin and his party. So I don't know if a coalition is really going to be viable there going forward. So we'll see. Definitely a lot of variables in play right now. Something to keep your eye on. Oh, we talked a lot about Indonesia last time, right? So they're actually in the news again. There have been
For what?
Mass protests. So there was there's been a big scandal in Indonesia about politicians' expenses. Basically, the Indonesian government, like a lot of governments, actually gives money to politicians, legislatures, whatnot, in order to help them with their housing and various other just little expenses. And it came out that they were receiving like a lot more money than they really needed. And the opposition got wind of that, and they're using it. And the public is very upset about it and has been protesting accordingly.
Interesting.
Yeah, it escalated over the past week or two because of footage of a police vehicle striking a protester. Yeah, I'm not sure if he was actually a protester or maybe just a rideshare driver who was in the area, but regardless, the vehicle hit him and he later died. And so that has the opposition even more incensed. Yeah, if you spend any time on Reddit, you probably saw video of that, actually. They actually caught the vehicle hitting him. So that made the rounds. And then more recently, a bunch of looters broke into the house owned by the finance minister just outside the capital. And just in the past few days, protesters have set fire to the parliament building.
Wow.
Now, the Indonesian government has actually responded to this by giving in to a number of demands. For example, the prime minister announced that they're going to revoke a number of policies, specifically the size of allowances is going to shrink, and there's going to be a moratorium on overseas work trips. Hasn't stopped the protests, so those are ongoing. There may be a crackdown sooner or later. The current prime minister is a guy who was a member of the previous junta that governed Indonesia for like 30 years. And not only was he in that government, he was actually... It's a little controversial, but he has nominally been implicated in the disappearance of dissidents during the junta. It's not entirely clear how direct his involvement was, but that has a lot of people in the opposition concerned that he may have authoritarian impulses. And if the protests get more violent, it may be that he gives in to some of those impulses and we have a crackdown. You'll definitely be hearing about Indonesia in the news in that case. How do you feel about screwworms, Neuro?
Screwworms?
Yeah.
I don't know what they are. What are they?
Well, they're basically these parasitic fly larvae that, well, basically the fly lays the eggs within your flesh, and then the worms eat your flesh and then emerge out of it, and then evolve into the fly.
Well, I feel gross about it then.
Yeah, they're not uncommon. They're actually native, I think, to Central America and Northern South America. But you don't see them in the United States much because there's been a big program over the past century to keep them out. Basically, they release a bunch of sterile flies, and that keeps the population low enough and prevents its spread from Central America. Every so often, though, they kind of break out anyway. I think the last outbreak was in the 70s. So there actually were screwworms in the southern US in the 70s for a while before they were able to push them out, basically, and get the population back under control. It looks like we're about to have another one. So there will be some flesh-eating fly larvae in the southern United States for a while.
Jeez.
Yeah, something to look forward to. Oh, also, I had an unintentionally hilarious headline for you.
Oh?
The headline is, Trump weighs deploying National Guard to Chicago, Democrats vow lawsuit. Yeah, that's a sign of the times if ever there was one. I'm sure the administration is very intimidated.
Promising a lawsuit. Chat saying ask me about protests in Serbia because of government corruption. I'm Serbian, so I'm curious.
We talked about that a couple weeks ago, I think. It's part of ongoing protests that have been... it's part of protests that have been ongoing, rather, since, I think, late last year, if not further back. I think the impetus was the collapse of a train station. No, not a train station. It was like a train stop or something like that. Anyway, some people died. An investigation revealed that shoddy construction was responsible, and that in turn was linked to government corruption. And so that sparked anti-corruption protests that have been demanding this, that, or the other reform from the Vučić administration, which is currently governing Serbia. Yeah, the protests are piggybacking on broad, well, not necessarily broad, anti-government sentiment amongst the political left in Serbia. They've been at odds with the Vučić administration for years now. They see him as authoritarian and they want to implement more liberal reforms in the country. Conservative supporters of Vučić are pretty opposed to that. And so those reformist elements in Serbia have kind of met with mixed success since Vučić came to power. But even if not everybody is on board with pro-democratization, pro-liberal reform efforts, pretty much everybody is on board with anti-corruption. And so liberal opponents of Serbia, of the Serbian government, have kind of shifted gears and shifted the focus of their protests to anti-corruption in order to broaden the base of their support, and they've been pretty successful in that. And so the result is that a much broader coalition of forces is now arrayed against Vučić than had previously been the case. But he hasn't really given ground either. I think there have been some minor concessions made. And I think part of the trouble the movement has is that they're not entirely coherent in the concessions they're demanding, something the government itself has pointed out. But beyond that, the protests haven't really gone anywhere. They've still managed to maintain momentum, even though it's been months now, which is impressive. But I wasn't aware of any particular change as far as the balance between the government and the protests. The government is under pressure but hasn't given way, and my understanding is that that is the continuing equilibrium.
Our chatter from Serbia is saying it's been going for 2 years and they're still growing.
Well, I thought the train thing was recent.
Oh, they mean the protests in general, I think.
Yeah, the protests in general have been ongoing for a long time. But again, the earlier iterations of those protests were more left-wing, liberal-oriented. And that particular politics is of limited popularity within Serbia. And so it wasn't until like the past, I want to say 6 months to a year, that the protests really got big enough to really pressure the government. I had thought that was the case. Maybe my timeline is mixed up here. Yeah, it was a canopy collapse at a railway station, and it happened in November 2024. Which actually, yeah, is about a year now. So yeah, the protests are older than the canopy station collapse, or the canopy collapse at the station, but the big mass protests that we've seen in Serbia recently are more recent, I guess. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say about it beyond that. I've seen any number of protest movements in Eastern Europe against, Orban, Vucic, what have you. Romania and Bulgaria as well. I think they've been quieter more recently, but they've definitely had their share of mass protests over the past 10 years. They tend to kind of just peter out. I haven't seen too many all that successful in the region. I don't doubt they have an effect. They at least give the opposition credibility as an alternative and a threat to the powers that be. But I've never seen them exact all of their desired concessions from a sitting government either. Well, are you terribly excited to get an update on Israel-Palestine?
Oh yeah, always.
Let's see, I had 5 items here. One has to do with Australia. Australia keeps popping up today. Let's see, so Australia has threatened to recognize an independent Palestinian state in September. That's part of a whole litany of, well, maybe not a litany, but a number of European states have threatened to recognize Palestinian independence if the Israeli government doesn't meet some of their concerns. So the Australian government is the latest government to join their ranks. Let's see, the Israelis assassinated the prime minister of the Houthi government in Yemen. It's not surprising, the Houthis have been lobbing rockets and missiles at Israel for the past couple months. So the Israelis have now retaliated by removing their head of state. I don't think it's going to change anything. They'll probably be replaced shortly, but the Israelis have at least signaled that they are capable of doing that. That's generally part of their package of approaches to deterrence, such as they define it. Let's see, some officials within the Israeli government have responded to various announcements by states that they might recognize a Palestinian state by threatening to annex the West Bank if they do so. I don't think they're threatening to annex all of it, but from the maps I've seen, they're threatening to annex like the vast majority of it, to the point where the only Palestinian-administered territories would be some of the major urban Palestinian areas, and they would be completely cut off from each other and separated by Israeli-controlled territory. So a little tit for tat here. The far-right Israeli government, or at least the far-right elements within the Israeli government, are threatening to do this in order to try to deter foreign states from recognizing Palestinian independence. And then the invasion of Gaza City, if not the broader part of southern Gaza that the Israeli government had been threatening, is now underway. They have been bombing targets in Gaza City for a couple of days now. I'm sure there will be lots of terrible things you'll be hearing about that.
What's their win condition? What are they trying to do?
Oh, they don't fucking have one. They say they do. The Netanyahu government says that their win condition, so to speak, is the destruction of Hamas, which, as anybody who's followed terrorism and counterterrorism over the past couple of decades would be able to tell you, is not something they can realistically do. So you could say the Israeli government has an unrealistic win condition, but I think the reality is that it's not actually a win condition. I think they're just pretending that's a win condition in order to justify something they already wanted to do, which is to invade Gaza. Now, what they want to do with Gaza is the real question. I don't think we really know that. That remains to be seen. But regardless, it's pretty clear nobody is going to stop them at this point. So one way or the other, we're about to find out. But it might take a couple weeks or months while they finish clearing out southern Gaza here. Actually, I did have a Trump thing that kind of ties into that, but I don't know how relevant it is. The Trump administration released a plan a week ago or so outlining their vision for how Gaza could be administered and rebuilt after the war. And it involves a bunch of bizarre bullshit. It involves the United States administering Gaza itself for a period of time, and also being responsible for its reconstruction. They would encourage, as part of this plan, the Palestinian population in Gaza to voluntarily leave, or if they don't want to leave, to be temporarily, quote unquote, temporarily relocated to refugee camps within Gaza. And the reconstruction would involve basically turning it into a kind of Mediterranean resort of some kind. They're a little cagey about the details there. It's basically a more detailed version of the plan that they announced earlier in the administration, in which they would kind of just move in, take control of it, and turn it into like a big casino or something. So I don't know if the announcement of that plan ties into the Israeli invasion of southern Gaza, or it's just the Trump administration trolling everybody again. I'm inclined to think it's the latter, since that is their pattern. But hypothetically, it could be indicative of some kind of understanding between the Israeli and American governments about how they're going to handle Gaza going forward. Again, nobody knows. Neither administration is really transparent about this, so we just kind of have to wait and see.
We do have a chatter from Jerusalem. They're Israeli. They said the people want the war over if we get the hostages.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I've heard. That is my understanding of the opposition's perspective. Hamas has said that they would be willing to end the war under those terms, but how much do you want to trust Hamas?
Mm-hmm.
I trust them about as much as I trust Netanyahu. They are kind of two sides of the same coin in many ways. We shall see. I don't really have much faith in the opposition in Israel's ability to really challenge the Netanyahu administration and get them to change course. So I strongly suspect that the war is just going to continue. We don't really fully know what Netanyahu has planned or what his goals are here. I know a lot of people think he's just doing it to distract people from the corruption charges, or maybe he's trying to acquire the land in order to appease the far-right elements in his coalition. But it could well be that he just wants to do it for the sake of it. That's kind of in his wheelhouse. You may see this as a unique opportunity to kind of kill two birds with one stone. One, reestablish deterrence against Hamas by employing extreme violence, and then also kind of cock-teasing the far right with the possibility of resettling the land. Yeah, he needs the far right elements in his coalition to maintain a majority in the legislature. So he does have to do something for them now and again. And basically just having an open-ended forever war in Gaza would actually kind of serve that purpose. He's well known for these kinds of self-serving maneuvers, so I really would not put it past him. Let's see. We did have a YouTube comment about Israel. Somebody mentioned that the large inflow of migrants from the former USSR helped tilt Israeli politics hard right over the past 35 years. That's true. It's a contributing factor, but there are other contributing factors there. So I would not place like the blame for that shift in Israeli politics purely on Soviet emigres. It has to do with, for one, the influx of Sephardic Jews. It's also relevant. That's something that kind of happened. It started more in the 50s. These are Jews from basically Arab countries. I think they're also known as Mazarik. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. But Arab Jews, let's call them, from the Middle East. They moved into Israel en masse in the 1950s as the result of pseudo-purges initiated in retaliation for wars with Israel in the late 40s, early 50s. Well, the war with Israel in the late 40s, and then the sort of Cold War they had going on in the 1950s. So that population was originally a minority. Originally, most of the Jews living in Israel after independence were of European descent. But when the Middle Eastern Arab Jews started coming in, they began to displace them. And over time, the demographics were such that the Ashkenazi Jews became a minority, and the Sephardic became a majority. And the Sephardic, or whatever you prefer to call them, I think the Israeli government just uses Sephardic as a generic catch-all term for Jews of Arab descent in the country. That population tends to be more conservative in their voting and politics than the Ashkenazi population. So that's also a factor for why Israel has kind of moved right over time. I remind everybody that the Ashkenazi Zionists that moved into Israel as part of the initial waves of immigration that defined the early demographics of Israel before it was independent. I'm talking like 1920s, 30s, etc. A lot of those people were actually radical left, if not outright communist, and that tended to have a disproportionate effect on the early political culture of Israel, the Jewish Agency, and then independent Israel later. It tended to be much more socialist and left-wing in orientation. Yeah, it's very much shifted away from that over time for the reasons that we're kind of discussing here. Let's see, so there's Soviet emigres, Sephardic Jews, and also a couple other factors. The growing population of ultra-Orthodox, they used to be pretty small, but they've expanded over time, and then also the settlers that have migrated into the occupied territories in the West Bank have grown in population over time, and obviously as a constituency, they prefer more radical approaches to the Palestinian issue, just inherently. So those are all relevant factors here. It's not just one thing. It's not just the emigres. Let's see, I had a couple tariff items. I know you guys love tariff discussion.
A fan favorite.
I know it's boring, but this is some of the most impactful, relevant stuff we discuss on here. And you don't get a lot in terms of impactful when you're talking about the Trump administration. So you got to take what you can get. So we didn't get to talk about this after it happened because we were off last week. But probably the biggest item we would have talked about last week is the court that had been judging the case against Trump's tariffs has ruled that they are in fact illegal. The reciprocal tariffs specifically. So the judge has ruled that the administration has until mid-October to wind up all of these tariffs that he's implemented. And if he does end up having to do this, then all of these little side deals that he's negotiated with this, that, and the other country are going to be unwound as well. So you could see significant changes in American tariffs if that happens. However, it probably won't. Because the reason the judge gave him a month or so in order to do that is because he wanted to give him time to appeal. And as you can imagine, the administration is definitely appealing. So most likely this case is going to end up before the Supreme Court, and they'll have a crack at it. Anybody's guess what they'll end up doing. They, quote unquote, should rule that it's illegal. That should be the ruling, given the standing law. But there's always room to interpret things differently, so they may well end up doing that. Everything pretty much up in the air until that case gets ruled on. But until then, the administration's whole trade policy has been dealt a pretty significant blow here. If they do end up having to wind down the tariffs, what they will probably end up doing is finding other legal loopholes to allow them to maintain them. And I don't doubt that there's a number of ways they can do that. Probably they will end up in court again over them, and the court in those cases will probably rule against them again. But this administration is perfectly fine with that, and the delay between the wrongdoing and the judgment is so large that in effect they'll be able to get their way. I don't know how long they'll be able to keep that up, but probably at least a year or two, in which case you'll have a year or two of American tariffs to contend with. Of course, it's always possible that Congress could get off its ass and actually impose new tariffs itself, in which case they would be totally legal, and the administration wouldn't have to be worried about this, but Congress isn't doing that, partly because they're focused mostly on negotiating the budget. I thought that they'd kind of already done that for the year, but apparently that was just another extension. Shows what I know. So another tariff update news. There was a snag in negotiations with Japan. We might have talked about this last time. I don't quite remember. But in case we didn't, the Trump administration still does not have a deal, quote unquote, with Japan. The Japanese thought that they were making progress, but there was a snag, which is that the Trump administration wanted them to open up their rice markets to exports of American rice. And as we've talked about before, multiple times, agriculture is a very politically sensitive sector for any government, to the point that in trade deals, it's almost always given an exemption from whatever tariff reductions are negotiated. So unsurprisingly here, the Japanese government balked at this, and negotiations have kind of reached a, what's the word I want? Stalemate, let's say. Let's see, the other item I had here had to do with NVIDIA. I thought I had something on Intel as well. That may be hanging out somewhere else. Well, NVIDIA, and we might have talked about this before too, will have to pay 15% of its revenue from sales to China to the US government. And apparently this is a quid pro quo in which they'll receive export licenses for their H20 chips. So they will be able to continue exporting to China, but they'll have to basically pay a bribe to the US government, which is what this really seems like, which would be illegal. But the Trump administration is justifying it by saying that it raises money and it at least inhibits trade with China. Nobody's really pleased with this, though, because if selling chips to China is a problem, you should just stop it outright. China's still getting their chips here, they're just having to pay a little more for them. So this kind of just feels like the Trump administration extorting a company for money. It doesn't really make sense from a national security standpoint. I would point out here that some trade analysts have said this isn't all bad, at least in terms of its impact on the economy and trade with China, because the H20 chip in question was actually specifically designed by NVIDIA in order to circumvent export restrictions imposed by the Biden administration. So these chips are not cutting-edge chips. They meet all of the Biden administration and now the Trump administration's export restrictions. And they continue to meet Chinese demand. So everything should have been okay, but the Trump administration made noise about restricting all sales of chips to China, whereupon there was some lobbying and eventually this weird quid pro quo. Oh, here we go. Okay. So there was also a deal with Intel. I think we've talked about that before as well. We have more details about it. So basically, the US government announced that it was going to buy a share of Intel, like its stock specifically. And interestingly, this is actually tied to the CHIPS Act. So the CHIPS Act involves the administration, well, the US government, giving subsidies to chip companies that meet certain qualifications outlined in the CHIPS Act. And one of the things the Trump administration has done since he's returned to power is to basically withhold the funds that were supposed to be dispersed under the act. Trump himself and his administration disagrees with the logic behind the CHIPS Act. They don't think the taxpayer should be paying companies to build stuff. They think tariffs should be used to incentivize production in the United States. So, in typical Trumpian fashion, rather than pushing the legislature to rescind or modify the bill, the CHIPS Act in this case, the Trump administration has instead taken the initiative and is just not paying companies the money that they're technically entitled to under the bill. And what they've done here is that they've actually reached a deal with Intel in which Intel will actually get CHIPS Act money, but in exchange it has to give up equity. It has to give up shares in the company, which is what the administration really meant when it said it was buying shares of Intel. Actually, they're just giving money they were entitled to already in exchange for, again, basically a bribe, basically just giving them shares. Now, the US government has tried to address concerns about conflicts of interest here by saying these shares are going to be non-voting shares. So they're not going to be able to interfere in the business operation of the company, supposedly. However, it's been noted more recently that if you read the fine print of the agreement, there's actually a lot of room for the United States government to interpret the fine print in a way that actually would allow them to interfere in business operations. So there's a possibility here that the US government could basically threaten Intel to disrupt their business operations if they don't do stuff for them, which might involve transferring money to this, that, or the other person or agency, or maybe doing favors or whatever. So there's a lot of room for corruption here, such as it is. Basically, the relevant rules include veto over decisions that would involve the firm, divesting itself of its foundry business. So effectively, Intel cannot stop manufacturing chips in the United States because the US government under this deal would be able to veto that if they wanted, which presumably they would. Also, the terms of the agreement allow the US government to weigh in on matters that, quote unquote, materially affect the firm's relationship with the US government, as well as with its relations with China. That's kind of ambiguous, so you could see how the US government would pretty easily be able to interpret virtually anything Intel does in a way that would trigger this clause. So there's a lot of suspicion in markets that effectively the US government has kind of acquired a veto over virtually anything that Intel does as part of this deal. Now, whether or not they actually use it, anybody's guess, but they could if they wanted, and therein lies the concern. I would point out, too, that the government conditioning legally designated funds that a company should get on that company giving the administration shares, money, whatever, all of that is illegal, at least as I understand it. So this is almost certainly all going to end up before a court, presumably. It may not end up being decided by a court because I think you have to have standing to bring suit for most things. And so it might be hard to find somebody with the appropriate standing here, because Intel itself is not going to sue over this. This is a deal they reached with the government. So somebody else would have to sue on their behalf. And I don't know that a lot of courts would allow that. So the standing issue is a problem there. But if it does end up before a court and somebody is found to have standing, I strongly suspect that this would get shot down in court. Just a little more institutional rot for you, I guess. Let's see, that's most of what I had. I did have a Trump highlight reel, but that's a perpetual motion machine of bullshit. So there's no inherent reason we have to do it. It'll just keep growing and we can do it later. It's up to you.
Gotcha. Well, I'm in a match right now. There have been some chatters asking about the Venezuela situation.
Oh, yeah, there's some dumb posturing happening down there.
Who's
the U.S. government... Huh?
Who's posturing?
Well, everybody. The Venezuelan government is doing some of its own, but mostly it's the U.S. government. I think I told you last time that the U.S. government had ordered naval assets into the Caribbean and that they were basically just kind of showing off and trying to intimidate countries in the region. Part of an attempt to re-emphasize the Americas and American grand strategy. At least that's what they say. I haven't really seen much strategy out of the Trump administration. But nominally, that's the reason they're doing that. In the past couple weeks, they've actually been having those naval assets engage with drug traffickers, allegedly. Supposedly, the administration is looking at using military assets to intercept drug traffickers, possibly even strike them within their own home countries, with or without the permission of those countries. Yeah, so the big news item there is that the Trump administration released video of the U.S. military, presumably, destroying a boat that they argue was trafficking drugs to the United States. They haven't really offered much evidence of that. And I think Vance actually said that technically the boat was on its way to Trinidad initially, not the United States, although he's since walked that back. But regardless, it's not clear whether they had the authority to do that, what the intelligence was. For all we know, it was just some dude. Anybody's guess. But regardless, we know that the military killed some guys in a boat. We have footage of that much, at least. So that has some people concerned about just what the U.S. military is going to end up doing in the Caribbean going forward. If they're just going to run around killing people, or maybe if they in particular have their sights set on Venezuela. The Trump administration has been making noise recently about how all of the drugs coming into the United States stem from drug runners in Venezuela, and how the Venezuelan government itself is tied to drug trafficking. So that would seem to signal an interest in confrontation with the Venezuelan government. The Venezuelan government itself is saying that this is what they want to do, and they've been making noise about the American government needing to respect the sovereignty of nations and wanting to invade Venezuela. I don't really take that seriously, though, because that's just stuff Chavista governments in the region have always said, whether it's true or not. So you can kind of consider this more kayfabe. Both governments have an interest in looking tough, and the rhetoric kind of reflects that, but I don't know that either is actually interested in a real confrontation. I'm pretty skeptical of that. And I would point out that the Maduro government and the Trump administration actually have a lot of history with kayfabe involving each other. They did this a lot in Trump's first term. They would make a lot of noise about how the other was a threat and they needed to do something about it, and then it would just kind of go away. Neither would actually do anything. Fake wrestling bullshit, basically. Actual true kayfabe. So I don't think anything is going to come from it this time, but it has been in the news, so I can see why people would be concerned. Yeah, I think one of the more recent developments there is that a couple of Venezuelan F-16s buzzed a flotilla of naval ships, U.S. Navy ships, I should say. And so the Trump administration came out and said that, if U.S. Navy vessels feel like they're being threatened, they are allowed to shoot down said threats. So kind of implying
Buzz
that,
it just mean to like fly really close?
yeah, basically. So I don't think they were even flying dangerously close, but the Trump administration kind of made it out like they were, and said, basically implied that if they kept doing it, they would shoot them down. But probably they'll just keep doing it anyway, and nothing will happen, I suspect. Yeah, this is theater of the absurd, basically. Neither side really wants to do anything, but they do want to look tough, so everybody's engaging in these little operations. Buzzing U.S. naval ships, U.S. naval ships blowing up drug trafficking motorboats, I guess. Like, all of that is just dumb political posturing. It's entirely possible it escalates. I don't know what the Trump administration actually has planned. Maybe they really do want to just strike random narco-related targets in Venezuela. Who's to say? But an actual invasion, like regime change in Venezuela, it hasn't worked ever in like 50 years. I can't imagine Venezuela would be any different. And Trump himself has run as the peace candidate. He's the guy that wants to avoid forever wars. So it would be pretty ironic, although somewhat predictably ironic, if he actually did start a forever war in Venezuela. We'll see, but until further information changes my mind, I'm writing it all off as kayfabe.
Yeah, I think using the phrase grand strategy when you're describing what you're doing, you're definitely zhuzhing it up a little bit.
Well, do we have any other questions?
I can check the Discord, but I don't think so. We had a nice historical focus on the Interwar years, which I have known very little about.
Yeah, just kind of a quick review of the conflicts therein. I don't think it's a complete review. And I think the politics and diplomacy of the interwar years are also very interesting. I didn't get to that at all. So yeah, there's a lot to get into there, and that's a very in-depth, that's a period of history with a lot of depth. We could talk about that for hours.
Well, cool. Well, this may be a reasonable spot to wrap it. You down to BG3 a bit?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, thank you, chat, for participating. Thank you, Agent Smith, for your time, and we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG!